Long before the sun first ignited, Middle-earth lay under a canopy of silver stars, a silent, slumbering wilderness. By the shores of Cuivianen, the water of awakening, the firstborn children of Ilúvatar opened their eyes. They looked up to the stars and found joy, yet in the shadows of the ancient woods, they found something else entirely: fear. The Dark Lord Melkor was already at work. His agents, draped in shadow, were silently culling the isolated and the wandering, capturing them to twist noble matter into the first ruined forms of orcs. The elves were not merely awakening, they were being hunted in their cradles. The survival of an entire species hung by a thread, threatened by a power so vast. It had once contended for the mastery of all creation. Then came the great rider, Orome, the sound of his horn, Valaroma, shattering the silence like thunder, rolling over the Iron Mountains. He brought the intelligence back to the west, to the blessed realm of Aman. The council of the Valar was brief and grim. The time for patience had ended. The time for guardianship through absolute force had begun. Manwë, King of the Winds, understood the tactical reality. Melkor would not yield to diplomacy, nor would he stop, until the firstborn were corrupted beyond redemption. To save the children, the powers of the world had to break the very peace they cherished. The earth groaned under a weight it had never known. The seas boiled. From the west, the hosts of the Valar marched forth, clad in the light of the two trees, projecting a force magnitude that would eventually rend the continents apart. This was no mere skirmish. This was the war of the powers. To understand the sheer magnitude of the offensive Manwë was about to launch, one must first understand the battlefield. This was not the Middle Earth of the Third Age, with its familiar coastlines and diminished borders. This was Arda, in its prime, a massive contiguous landmass, where geography itself was a weapon of war. The strategic theater was dominated by Melkor's defensive architecture in the north. His domain was not merely a kingdom, it was a fortified zone stretching across the top of the world. The primary defensive line was the arid Engren, the Iron Mountains. These were not naturally occurring peaks formed by tectonic drift. They were reared by Melkor in the earliest days as a physical wall against the light of the Valar. They stood taller than any range in later history, a jagged rampart of black basalt and ice, forming an arc that shielded the uttermost north from any assault coming from the west. Deep behind this wall lay the center of gravity, Utumno. This was no simple citadel. It was a subterranean complex of vast proportions, delving deep into the bedrock of the world. It housed the armories, the breeding pits, and the throne of the Dark Lord. To strike at Utumno was to strike at the planet's foundations. However, Melkor, possessing the mind of a master strategist, understood that a static defense in depth required a forward operating base to blunt an enemy advance. Thus, to the west of Utumno, closer to the shores where the Valar would land, he had built Angband. At this time, Angband was not the capital it would later become under Morgoth's return. It was the shield. It was the breakwater, designed to shatter the first wave of the Valar's wrath. Commanding this fortress was his lieutenant, Myron, known to history as Sauron. His task was simple: delay the Valar, lead their strength, and buy time for Melkor to marshal the full terror of the underworld. Facing this entrenched nightmare was the host of Valinor. In terms of numbers, the Valar were few. There were no vast battalions of elves or men to aid them. The children were the prize, not the soldiers. This was a force comprised of the Aratar, the high powers of Arda, supported by the Maiar, spirits of the same order as Sauron, and the Balrogs, but clad in the raiment of the Blessed Realm. The logistical challenge for Manwë was unique. He did not need to worry about supply lines, food, or fodder. His constraint was collateral damage. The elves at Cuivianen were fragile, flesh and blood creatures who had just awoken. They were located far to the east, if the Valar unleashed their full, unbridled power, they risked shattering the tectonic plates of Middle-earth and drowning the very elves they sought to save. Therefore, the campaign required a split operational focus. A detachment, likely led by Orome, had to secure the perimeter around Cuivianen, establishing a defensive screen to shield the elves from the seismic and magical fallout. Meanwhile, the main shock force, led by Tulkas the Strong and guarded by the craftsmanship of Aule, would launch a frontal assault on the northwest. The plan was a brutal application of overwhelming force concentrated on a narrow front. They could not afford a long war of attrition, which would scar the earth permanently. They needed a decapitation strike. They had to breach the Iron Mountains, crush the resistance at Angband, and isolate Utumno before Melkor could unleash his ultimate reserves. Melkor's disposition was formidable but flawed. He had spent eons dispersing his native power into the matter of Arda, into the gold, the ice, and the flesh of his monsters, to control them. He was functionally stronger than any single Valar, but he was grounded, heavy, and increasingly bound to his physical form. He relied on fear and the impregnability of his fortifications. He believed that the Valar would not dare to attack him, for fear of destroying the world. He miscalculated. The Valar had resolved that a broken world was better than a corrupted one. The staging area was the western coast of Middle-earth, and the sea itself, under the command of Ulmo, acted as the transport mechanism. As the host of the West made landfall, the very atmosphere changed, and the shadows that Melkor had breathed across the continent began to recoil. The air pressure dropped. The ground trembled rhythmically, not from an earthquake, but from the marching feet of Tulkas and the war host of the Maya. The Siege of Utumno was not destined to be a battle of weeks or months. It would be a grinding, cataclysmic struggle measured in years, where mountains would be treated as temporary obstacles, and the geography of the world would be rewritten by the violence of the gods. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and in the dark deeps of Angband, Sauron watched the horizon burn with a light that had not been seen in Middle-earth since the destruction of the lamps. The first engagement was not announced by a trumpet, but by a seismic convulsion that registered across the entire continent. When the host of the Valar struck the forward defensive perimeter of the north, the impact was so violent that the geography of Middle-earth began to liquefy. The war began in earnest at the gates of Angband. This fortress, commanded by Sauron, was designed to act as a breakwater, a series of interlocking fortifications meant to bleed the momentum of the western host. But the fury of the Valar had been underestimated. They did not lay siege to Angband in the traditional sense. They simply walked over it. The swiftness of the assault was terrifying. The upper towers of Angband were sheared off. The iron gates crumpled like parchment, and the vaulted ceilings of the upper levels collapsed inward. Sauron, realizing the tactical situation was untenable, did not stand and fight to the death. He was a creature of order and logic dictated survival. He abandoned the surface defenses and withdrew his forces deep into the labyrinthine roots of the fortress, sealing the vaults behind him. The Valar, with their eyes fixed on the ultimate prize, Melkor himself, did not stop to root out every cavern and cellar. They bypassed the ruined hulk of Angband, leaving the lieutenant buried but alive, a strategic oversight that would haunt the world for 3 ages. The advance continued. The target was Utumno. Here, the resistance stiffened. Utumno was not merely a castle, it was a tumor in the earth, protected by the Iron Mountains, the arid Engren. To reach the Dark Lord, the Valar had to physically dismantle the mountain range that shielded him. This was the phase of the war where the map was redrawn. As Manwë unleashed the winds and Ulmo summoned the subterranean waters, the land buckled. The great inland sea of Helkar, where the Elves had awakened, was whipped into a frenzy, its waters rising to swallow the surrounding plains. To the west, the destruction was absolute. The sheer force of the magical and physical bombardment caused the earth to groan and split. Vast tracts of land slid into the ocean. The Great Sea, the Belagaea, rushed in to fill the voids, widening the distance between Middle-earth and Valinor. New bays were carved out of the coastline in mere hours. The Bay of Valar was born not by erosion, but by the cataclysm of battle. Far to the east, the Quendi, the Elves, crouched in the forests of Quivianen. They did not see the battle, they felt it. They felt the vibrations in the soil, a rhythmic thumping that felt like the heartbeat of a dying world. They saw the northern horizon illuminated by flashes of lightning, red, green, and blinding white, that painted the undersides of the clouds. And this was the war of the powers, as witnessed by mortals, a terrifying storm that refused to end. The Siege of Utumno itself lasted for a span of years that is difficult to quantify, but time flowed differently in the Elder Days. Melkor unleashed everything he had. From the gates poured Balrogs, spirits of fire and shadow, whipping the air into flame. Great monsters of horn and ivory, red in the dark, charged the lines of the mire. But the host of Valinor was methodical. They were not fighting with hatred. They were fighting with the cold efficiency of a surgeon cutting out a cancer. Slowly, the perimeter tightened. The outer walls of Utumno were pulverized by Aul the smith, the very maker of the earth's substance. He understood the fracture points of the stone. He knew how to unravel the enchantments that held the dark masonry together. The roof of the world began to cave in, and the sunless pits were exposed to the starlight for the first time in eons. Then came the breach. The gates of Utumno, forged of black steel and spell-wrought iron, were shattered. The Valar entered the citadel. The fighting moved from the open plains to the claustrophobic corridors of the underworld. The sheer noise was deafening. The clangor of metal on stone, the roaring of beasts, the commanding voices of the Aratar. They swept through the halls, driving the forces of darkness deeper and deeper, down toward the throne room at the very bottom of the abyss. Melkor sat upon his dark throne in the uttermost deeps. For the first time in his existence, the mightiest of the Ainur knew fear. He heard the footsteps of his brother, Manwë. He heard the laughter of Tulkas. Melkor was a being of immense power, but his power was dispersed. He had poured his essence into the ground to control it, into his servants to dominate them. He was the master of the earth, but he was stretched thin. The Valar who approached him were focused, their spirits burning with a concentrated light he could no longer endure. He fled. The Dark Lord, the king of the world, abandoned his throne and retreated into the furthest corner of his own dungeon. But there was nowhere left to go. The climax of the war was not a debate or a duel of magic. It was a physical confrontation. Tulkas Astaldo, the valiant, the Valar of strength and prowess, stepped forward. Tulkas bore no weapon. He needed none. He was the embodiment of the joy of strength, the force that overcomes inertia. Melkor turned to fight, but the contest was unequal. Tulkas grappled with the Dark Lord. It was a collision of archetypes, the Golden Wrestler against the Iron Tyrant. The impact of their struggle shook the foundations of the seabed, thousands of miles away. But Tulkas was tireless, and Melkor was weary from the weight of his own malice. With a heave that might have lifted a mountain, Tulkas forced Melkor face down upon the floor of his own hell. The laughter of Tulkas rang out, not in mockery, but in the sheer exultation of victory. An owl stepped forward. In his hands, he held Angband, the chain. It was a masterpiece of craft, forged of a material called Tilkal, a compound of copper, silver, tin, lead, iron, and gold. Harder than dragon scale and unbreakable by any physical force. The chain was whipped around Melkor's neck. It was bound about his wrists and ankles. The links tightened, biting into his spiritual and physical form. The iron crown, the symbol of his dominion, was beaten from his head. His collar was forged to the chain, and for the first time, the great enemy was helpless. The silence that followed was heavy. The roaring of the fires died down. The earthquakes ceased. The dust began to settle over the ruins of Utumno, and the Valar stood over their captive, their light illuminating the squalor of the pit. They had won. They had achieved the impossible military objective. They had neutralized the supreme threat without destroying the world in the process. But as they dragged the bound Melkor up from the deeps, leaving the shattered gates of Utumno behind, the victory was already shadowed by what they had left undone. In the chaos, in the haste to capture the king, the cellars had not been purged. The lieutenant, Sauron, remained free in the ruins of Angband. The Balrogs hid in the roots of the earth, waiting. The Valar had cut off the head of the snake, but they had left the venom in the soil. The war ended, not with a treaty, but with a procession. The great enemy, bound hand and foot in the unbreaking chain, Angband, was dragged from the ruins of his own kingdom. He was hauled across the grinding ice of the Helcarax, over the ocean, and finally to the gates of Valinor. There, in the Ring of Doom, he was cast down before the feet of Manwë. The sentence passed was not death, for the Ainur cannot die within the circles of the world. Instead, it was absolute containment. Melkor was cast into the halls of Mandos, the fortress of the dead, to abide in the fastness of the prison of the Valar for 3 long ages. The world was finally safe, or so it seemed, but the cost of this safety was etched into the very crust of the planet. The geography of Middle-earth had been irrevocably altered. The violence of the powers had shattered the northern coastlines. Great rifts had opened in the earth, and the sea had rushed in to heal the wounds, creating the bays and firths that would define the map of Beleriand for the next age. The connection between the continents was fractured, leaving only the grinding ice of the north as a bridge. The physical symmetry of Arda, designed in the Song of Creation, was ruined forever. This was the first true manifestation of Ardamart. For the Elves, the immediate objective was achieved. The shadows receded. The stars shone clear again. It was this victory that allowed Orome to return to Cuivinen and issue the summons that would begin the great journey. Without the War of the Powers, there would be no High Elves, no light in the faces of the Noldor, no kingdoms of Beleriand. The civilization of the Eldar was bought with the violence of the Valar. Yet from a military perspective, the campaign contained a catastrophic error, a failure of post-conflict stabilization. In their haste to capture the commander, the Valar neglected to clear the field. They were eager to return to the light of Aman and bring the elves with them. They did not comb the ruins of Angband. They did not hunt down the lieutenants. Deep in the vaults that the Valar had bypassed, the Balrogs slept, waiting for the call of their master. And more dangerously, Sauron remained at large. The tactician, the organizer, the shadow behind the throne, he was left behind in the dark. While the Valar celebrated in the eternal light of the West, Sauron began the long, slow work of rebuilding. He would spend the next 3 ages repairing the armories, breeding the orcs, and preparing the logistics for his master's inevitable return. The War of the Powers was a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic failure. It won a period of peace, the peace of Arda, but it ensured that the war was not over. It was merely postponed. The victory proved that evil could be contained, but it also proved that as long as the world existed, evil could not be wholly eradicated. The long defeat had begun, and the seeds of the next war were already sprouting in the ruins of the last.